Can I check? Can I just check whether you can see the chat or not?
I haven't looked at the chat. Let me have a look at the chat.
I won't look at the chat because there'll be too many screens for me, but I will look at the chat after with pleasure.
Sure, the speaker's normally excluded from the chat. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I've just noticed that Fiona's saying she's from Scotland, Rebecca's saying she's from Italy, and Andrea's saying she's from Canada. That's what's in the chat. So welcome, everybody. Okay, let's get started. And I'm just going to say hello to everyone again. And I'm Nick Fox, and I'm one of the conveners of the BSA's New Materialisms Study Group. So welcome to this, the first seminar in an international series for 2022, which we're going to run from now until the Northern Hemisphere autumn. And thanks for joining us today. So our speaker is Sarah Elton. And Sarah is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology at Toronto Metropolitan University, Ontario. And she's the founding director of the Food Health Ecosystems Lab. She's going to be talking to us about her research on plant-human assemblages and on the agency of plants in the production of health in two very different sites. First, the vegetable garden, and second, the human gut. So Sarah's going to speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have plenty of time for questions. If you have a question, can I ask that what you do is use the chat facility to alert me. You can just write question, and I'll come to you in order once we get to the Q&A. Or if you don't want to ask your question in person, then just write your question in the chat, and I will then read that out and pass it on to Sarah. But in the rest of the time, if you're not speaking, can you now please mute yourself and keep muted throughout through Sarah's talk. But now over to you, Sarah, if you'd like to take over and share your screen.
You should be able to see my PowerPoint slides as they are appearing. Let me organize I'm still getting used to anyway, I'll just leave it there. That Zoom bar likes to put itself right in the most inconvenient places. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to Nick Fox and to the BSA for New Materialism Study Group for inviting me today. I'm very pleased to be presenting. My name is Sarah Elton. I'm a critical qualitative health researcher, and I do work on food systems. And I'm joining you from the settler colonial city of Toronto. This is the shared territory of several sovereign Indigenous nations, the Haudenosaunee Nations and the Wendat Nation. And where I live is part of their traditional shared gathering grounds through the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. Today, I'm going to play around with some post-humanist theory, and I'm going to draw on my empirical work to theorize people-plant relations in the production of health. So I think about human-plant relations in three sites: the gut, vegetable gardens, and produce supply chains. And these are all sites where plants produce health in relation at three different scales. And I think at three different scales that we can think about these human-plant relations. I've been working on produce supply chains only since the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm currently working on publishing some initial findings. So I'm not gonna talk about that just yet. But I am going to talk about the garden and the human gut, and the gut being a new area of research for me, also rooted in my readings of the medical literature and that, the popular discourse, sometimes called microbiomania, this public discourse. I'm playing around with merging some ideas in this forum today. So you've given me an opportunity to put these two sites into conversation. It's a bit of an experiment, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the theory, provide the context, and then move to part two, where I'll tell you about my research in Toronto gardens. Part three, I'll look more briefly at the gut. and move on to the concluding discussion. My remarks might take me about a little longer than 30 minutes, but I'll have my eye on the clock so I know to make time for our discussion, which I look forward to. So the question that's driving my talk today is, how do non-humans matter to human health at the two sites? How do non-humans matter in the context of health and food systems? The non-humans I most like to think with are plants, and because I'm increasingly finding it hard to separate plants out from their ecosystems, other humans are going to join us today, obviously, namely microbes. I want to situate my work with posthumanism in the context of Indigenous ways of knowing. So I don't know how much people in the UK and our international guests today here are exposed to these ideas of decolonization as they're happening on Turtle Island, but they are very important discourses for us here on Turtle Island. For example, my university just changed its name in an effort to support reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. These discourses shape my work too, and decolonization is something I'm always thinking through. Not something that I've figured out by any stretch of the imagination, but something that I'm thinking about. And my thinking about the city where I live has been profoundly shaped recently by a chapter that I read by Libby Porter, an Australian academic. And I thank the anonymous reviewer who brought this chapter to my attention. Porter asks us to think of a city like Toronto as an Indigenous place. And she writes that calling the city an Indigenous place, and I'm quoting her, is to call for a more truthful and accurate account of what cities are and how they are knitted into structures of settler colonial domination. So this is important for me to do as an uninvited person living here on Turtle Island. My grandmother comes from London. My grandfather's family were Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe via the United States. And the other side of my family is Scottish, Irish, English. My ancestors all sought economic opportunity here, a chance to escape poverty, or in the case of my Jewish relatives, a chance to escape pogroms. I've inherited the settler privilege that they had when they arrived on this colonized Indigenous land. And just one example that is related to my work on human-plant relations that are, of course, inevitably rooted in the land is that I own land in a place where the Indigenous laws don't actually recognize private land ownership. That's a colonial construct. So I own land, my parents own land, my grandparents own land, my great-grandparents did too. So this generational wealth accumulated in cities. So that's why I follow Libby Porter's example and how she positions her writing, and I situate my own work on human-plant relations in this context of settler colonialism. So when I talk about human-plant relations and posthumanist theory, most importantly, I want to be clear that the idea that non-humans are part of our social worlds is not a Euro-Western idea. I have been learning from reading works by Indigenous scholars, including Leroy Littlebear, Vanessa Watts, Gregory Cajete. I've been learning that Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island have thought of plants as kin, as medicine, as world makers. So I want to situate my own work on human-plant relations very humbly in the context of Indigenous ontologies. And I want to recognize that these are sophisticated knowledge systems that long preceded posthumanist thought. As Métis scholar Zoe Todd recently pointed out in a talk, these Indigenous knowledge systems are actually ontologically different from the posthuman term, or the more than human term, whatever you would like to call it. I try to engage with Indigenous knowledge by citing Indigenous scholars, and also in response to Zoe Todd's call for a citational revolution. So I do this as a way to recognize that there is a deep body of thinking in this area that precedes the more than human term. And I don't mean to do this to confer settler colonial advantage, but rather to try to disrupt colonial narratives. I haven't figured out how to do this quite yet, but I am trying. I'm going to define posthumanism and draw out some key themes so you know how I come at this social theory. So I work with posthumanist social theory to consider the implications of seeing humans as equal to all non-human life forms and systems. I want to disrupt what Kim Tallbear calls the settler colonial nature culture binary. Val Plumwood called it a dualism. There we go. Posthumanism separates, decenters the human. It places humans on the same ontological plane as animals, plants, and all other life and life systems that make up the biosphere. And the dualism, this settler colonial nature culture binary, has created hierarchical relationships with man, and I used man with a capital M at the top of the hierarchy in the tradition of Sylvia Wynter. This relegates nature and everyone associated with nature to an inferior position. So women, racialized people, indigenous people. Sylvia Wynter explains all this very clearly in her work. So posthumanism decenters the human. Posthumanism, here we go, I have this, the clicking problem. There we go. Posthumanism recognizes that humans are inextricably connected to non-human nature. Humans are part of nature. Posthumanism recognizes that humans are, non-human nature is not inert, but that all things in nature have agency, so they can cause effects, they can make things happen. And this agency is relational. And I'll explain more about that in a few minutes with regard to plants. So why plants? Why am I interested in plants? Plants have been fundamental to the Euro-Western colonial project that continues to unfold today in today's global industrial food system that fascinates me. Europe's financial interest in plants has fueled the expansion of empire since the late 15th century. And scholars such as Beskey and Padway have explored how people partnered with plants like sugarcane, wheat, coffee, cotton, these partnerships to colonize and to oppress. This continues today. And that's what interests me in plants, especially in the commodity chains. But plants are also intimate companions to the participants in my study of Toronto gardens. We all have intimate relationships with plants because we eat them, and we need them to be healthy. So there are many types of plants and many types of relationships with plants. Head et al. Describe these relationships with their term vegetal politics. And this is a concept they introduced to capture the political role that plants play. In the social sciences and the humanities, there's a burgeoning plant turn that looks at plants in society. So for example, scholars like Sophie Chow. These images on the slide, they connect the California almond trees, plants with nut sellers in Old Delhi. This image really connects the legacy of Great Britain's colonial project in India with settler colonialism in the United States. And the reason I selected this image of the Delhi shop selling California almonds is that it is a snapshot from this multi-species contact zone that is the global industrial food system that is the background for my work. So plants are also important to health. We can't breathe without them. We need them to eat. Clothes, some of our clothes are made with plants. They provide material for our shelters. Ancient plants are our fuels, our fossil fuels. And the human relationship with plants is a perfect example of relational health. So relational health, as I define it in a social science and medicine article last year, it recognizes that we would not breathe or eat or live without the myriad of life forms and systems of the biosphere, everything from microbes to soil systems, animals, plants. And in a relational health view, health is a constantly unfolding process that is produced by encounters between humans and non-humans. So there are many, many scholars exploring these linkages in the social sciences. Fox and Aldred wrote in 2016 that a relational approach, and I'm quoting, radically decenters human well-being from its privileged position within public health discourse to explore instead the multiple economies of affects within a broad assemblage of human and non-human relations. So humans are part of a health assemblage. Now, I don't want to lionize the relationships between humans and non-human nature. Sometimes when species meet, the outcome is not good. We could talk at length about zoonotic diseases, et cetera, et cetera. But I still, mostly the encounters are positive, and that's really the angle that I'm taking today. the human-non-human relationship is a health-supporting relationship. So this idea of health produced through relationships between non-humans and humans stands in contrast to conventional understandings of health in Euro-Western institutions. In terms of health and food, it's the same thing. The understandings are as follows. Okay. So the biomedical frame is one frame we think of food and health. Food is good for me because it is good for my body. We are all very familiar with that. Food access frame, where we think of health in considerations in terms of food security and food insecurity. So who has access to wet food at an individual, community, and population level, of increasing urgency in our world currently. Then there's the food environment frame, where health is considered in terms of the retail foodscape. So what's sometimes described with a term by Egger and Swinburne, obesogenic environment, and this is a so-called pathological environment in terms of limited opportunities for physical movement and poor quality of food. So none of these frames actually consider non-human nature. Of course, there are scholarly approaches that do connect human health to that of ecosystems and non-humans. So planetary health, One Health, eco health, these are some examples. However, it has been observed by other scholars that these approaches have had a marginal impact on mainstream public health and medicine, and hence the need for a post-humanist intervention. So similarly, in food systems thinking, non-humans are not considered equal participants. Typical in food studies, you'll find what Bennett calls the Conquest model of consumption. I would add to that and say the Conquest model of consumption and production, because the prevailing ideas about food systems cast the human as the farmer and the producer, the transformer of food, and it ignores the agency of all non-human things and processes that work so that we can eat, or that have agency. What I'm going to propose today is that a post-humanist lens applied to two sites, the two sites, the gardens and the gut. I'm going to propose that a post-humanist lens applied here disrupts human-centered understandings of food systems and also health. I ask, how do non-humans matter in terms of health in the context of food systems? And what does a relational health lens rooted in posthumanism, what does it allow us to see? It also highlights, I think, the importance of thinking about health in terms of relationships stretching beyond the individual. So to do this, first I must explore plant agency. So plant agency, of course, is not the same as human agency. Plants are not like us. They do not act with intent. Rather, plants have agency because they influence, they shape, they determine, they make things possible. Their agency emerges in the relationships they have with humans. So the agency is relational. Jane Bennett, who writes about non-human agency, describes thing power, and her approach, and I'm quoting, aims to attend to the it as actant. She continues, there is a moment of independence from subjectivity possessed by things, a moment that must be there since things do in fact affect other bodies, enhancing or weakening their power. So what I take from this is that things are constantly shaping and influencing our social worlds, our health, even if Euro-Western society hasn't really noticed this. So I studied human-plant relations in urban vegetable gardens, such as community gardens, allotment gardens, backyard gardens. The gardens, in my view, well, generally gardens in the city, food-producing gardens, are part of non-market food economy, where food is grown and distributed outside the market economy and is very worthy of study. I argue that in the gardens, where I conducted a multi-species ethnography, that plants are health actors. So plant agency was manifested in my study through relationships in the community vegetable garden. Plants in the community vegetable garden produce food, healthy food that people don't have to pay for. The participants I interviewed in my study, they reported to me that just growing a garden supported their mental health and also their physical health, because Gardens keep you moving, keep you active. And the literature on gardening supports this. And then the plants depend on the gardeners for water, for soil, for care. The gardeners and the plants exist together in health supporting relationships. So it's from this interdependence between people and plants that the plant's agency in the city emerges. Part of the fieldwork I conducted was in a neighborhood that was being redeveloped from an exclusively state-funded social housing community that's part of the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. So you can see in my slide here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, the old buildings, and then these are some of the new buildings. So these are torn down, and this is what it's being replaced with. They're transforming, it's still underway, a mixed, this social housing community into a mixed income area with a lot of private ownership in terms of condos. And Regent Park in Toronto, it's 69 acres of downtown, very downtown, valuable real estate in a gentrifying city. It's also a neighborhood where for decades people have grown food. So to remake the neighborhood involved building these new condos on some of the vegetable gardens. But the residents wanted space to grow plants and they advocated for it. And they were able to at least get some gardens included in the new design. So the design was amended to accommodate the material requirements of plants, basically soil and space to grow. So in this photo, what you can see here is a rooftop garden on a social housing building where people have plots. You can see how close it is to downtown. That's the downtown of our city. And let me explain in more detail how this came about. How was space in this gentrifying city, in this neighborhood, allocated to plants? The redevelopment reduced access to gardening. Conversely, making room for growing food was central to the vision of the redevelopment. So how did this happen? Well, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation consulted the community before the project began. And from this, they created a social development plan that was to guide the redevelopment. And the plan endorsed community gardens. So recommendation 5 and 6 of 75 recommendations identified community gardens as a priority for residents. By the time I showed up in Regent Park, 2/3 of the new neighborhood had already been constructed, and gardens remained a feature of the area. So space to grow food producing plants had been incorporated in both building design and the neighborhood in general. There are rooftop gardens like this on 3 community housing buildings. Private condos also had garden beds on the roof, and there was a community garden in the big centerpiece park of the neighborhood. And yet, despite these new formal growing spaces, that most of the gardening happening in Regent Park was taking place in these last remaining spaces of the neighborhood. So in this photo, you can see the gardens around the old buildings where there still was space left that hadn't been built on. And when I was there, this new crop of what they called guerrilla gardens appeared, claiming this vacant space for food production. So these are all new gardens that popped up. So how is this an example of plant agency? Well, Le Gun writes, plants create opportunities and constraints for action. So Le Gun studies the commercial apple industry and finds that the ways that apples grow, look, and taste fundamentally determine how the industry works. The agency of apples is manifested through their impact on production systems. In Regent Park, plant agency was manifested via the human-plant relationship. So firstly, the interspecies relationships provided an opportunity to design a neighborhood where plants were allocated scarce space. This involved the plants in the socio-political processes of the neighborhood. So plants claim space to grow. They claim the space through their provisioning relationships with gardeners. Plants need space to grow and attention. That is, of course, the heart of any urban agriculture project. If you plant food in the city, you take space away from another use, like parking. Boy, do we love our parking here in the city, or building. also love our condos. I do not include myself in that R actually. But the material requirements of plants for the space led people to advocate for gardens. And this advocacy was supported by the plants themselves, their physical presence, and their relationships with gardeners that was recognized in the social development plan. And sorry, just to be clear, it's the parking that I would prefer to plant than to park. So that summer of my fieldwork, these guerrilla gardens appeared. They became these protest spaces where people and plants claimed land and made a statement about the redevelopment and made a statement about who holds right to plant food in the city. This collaboration was a case of what Bailing and Suryanarayan call interspecies resistance. So the posthumanist lens makes visible the plants as actors. I also argue that they are health supporting actors. And that's because the plants offer health services to humans in a relationship of care. They offer food and the humans offer watering, weeding, etc. The plants of Regent Park demonstrate how non-humans can be health actors, how they can co-produce the conditions for health, influencing the way people live. So it is really in this way that plants were imbricated in sociopolitical processes. And this supports a view of health as a relational process, as opposed to a status. So health is not something I possess, rather health is constantly being produced by relationships of all sorts at many scales in society. The Regent Park case makes visible how the plants are imbricated in the socio-political processes of the neighborhood, and reminds us that human-plant relations are political. And if human-plant relations are political, then we need to be asking questions of equity and justice. I'm now going to shift to talk about the gut, and I'll come back briefly to questions of justice in the conclusion. So another scale at which health is produced between people and plants, and of course also microbes, is the gut. And I'm sure you've seen the headlines. Our bodies are crawling with all sorts of microscopic life forms. They live in our skin, our eyes, but everywhere, I guess, many different places, but the gut is my focus. And because why that is a very intimate site of people-plant relations. It's a place where plants and bacteria work together to produce our health. So in our guts, bacteria and other microorganisms transform plant matter that we eat into health-supporting chemicals such as short-chain fatty acids. When I read the scientific literature about the microbiome, the research disrupts human-centered understandings of food systems and also health. So I'm jokingly titled the next 1 minute of my talk, A Social Scientist Presents an Abridged Summary of Gut Microbiome Medical Science Research. I do need to spend a few minutes on this. So when we eat, our food passes through the gastrointestinal tract. And we don't talk about it very much in one of the worlds I inhabit, which is food studies. But our GI tract is central to eating. In our gut, food is converted into chemicals, and these chemicals are the nutrients and energy we absorb into our bodies. The gut is not just where we digest. The gut is also part of our immune system. 70% of immune function is in the gut. And the microbiome, the gut biome, plays a key role in both digestion and immune function. There is tons of research in the medical science about this. But here I will draw out one point that is relevant to food systems and health thinking. So in the gut, there are bacteria that we call commensal bacteria because they help us out. One thing the microbes do in our gut is produce fatty acids that we cannot make ourselves, but that we need to live, and we need them to be healthy. So when we eat foods that the commensal bacteria like, such as fibrous plant foods, whole grains, one example, the commensal bacteria are healthy. So over millenniums, we have co-evolved with microorganisms so that the things that the commensal bacteria do in our body end up being things we need to be healthy. And here's where it gets really groovy. So we are so interdependent with microbes that humans have been described as hollow bionts. So this is the term used to describe the assemblage that is the human. So we are made up of microbes. We can't exist without them. We are just a network that has evolved together. We're like a hologram for bacteria. And I know this term holobionts, this is from the medical literature. This is not in social theory, and it raises so many questions. So thinking about human-plant relations in the context of the gut microbiome underlines this profoundly relational nature of human health. You don't just need plants to be healthy. You don't just need to eat them. You need the microbes in your gut to digest the plant material, to make certain fatty acids available to your body to be healthy. So healthy eating is a multi-species health assemblage of people, of plants, of microbes. And if we think about it, really all the systems of the biosphere that enable plants to convert solar energy into our food in the first place. But the interdependencies between humans and non-humans doesn't stop there. As people who live in this industrial world, when we eat industrially produced foods, many of us live in cities, we don't just automatically have good microbes in our gut. Our resident gut microbes are shaped by who we live with, where we live, where we work, what air we breathe, whether or not we have pets, whether or not we choose to eat whole grains or we eat lots of fast food. So conversely, the way that gut microbiome is often discussed in health podcasts, the media, or frankly, even in the medical literature, it often makes it seem like this gut is a question of individual health. It's your responsibility to eat well. You need to buy your probiotics, you need to drink kombucha, but our gut depends on a lot more than what we just put in our mouths. It's more than an individual issue. Our gut community is determined in part by our social worlds. So if our resident microbes are shaped by who we are and what we do and where we live and where we eat, then our microbes are shaped by the same social forces that we are. So that means, like plants, our gut bacteria are imbricated in sociopolitical processes. So that brings me back to my research question. How do non-humans matter in the context of health and food systems? To that question, I'm going to add now, how does an understanding of health in terms of food systems shift when we think of the non-humans in these socio-political systems? So I've described two very different sites of human-plant relations. In the garden, I found health to be relational, produced by people-plant relations, and these people-plant relations were bound up in the socio-political processes of the neighborhood. In the gut, health is similarly relational. It's produced by a complexity of human and non-human relationships. And these relationships are similarly imbricated in socio-political systems. So when we think about the human relationship with non-human nature in terms of health as a relational issue, it invites thinking about power, about structure, it invites systems thinking, and it really raises questions about equity and justice. Posthumanism, I think, can help to make visible what some might call the political ecology of human relationships with non-human nature. So when we consider plants as health actors, we have to think again past the individual and see the person and the plants, and of course, the microbes and the ecosystems and beyond. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to engaging with you now.
Sarah, thank you so much. That's an amazing seminar, really fascinating material. And I'd like to invite questions, please. If you want to ask a question, could you just type in the chat question or just Q, and then I'll come to you. I see no questions at the moment. The thing that strikes me really about your talk is the point that you make it clear that we are not only caught up in an assemblage which involves human matter and non-human matter, but also, well, not the plant matter of the gut and the food that we eat, but also a huge range of other affective entities as well. And so it seems to me that what we have here is we have to, what this perspective, this post-human perspective allows us to do is to really start to unpack how narrow sociology's understanding of of social order and politics has been. And I just wondered if you got anything to say about whether you see a wider impact of this work for sociology.
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, this feeling of there being no end